God, I do.
All right, it's 1 o'clock. Let's go ahead and get started. Jason, I'll do a quick intro and then we'll turn it over to you for the main event here. So, hello, folks. Thanks for tuning in. My name's Brian Hirsch. I'm with 30 to 80. 30 to 80 is committed to changing the odds for government and for people who they serve. We've got a proven approach to improving the success rate of digital projects in government from below 30% to greater than 80%. And our mission is to make successful delivery the default. So we run a one-year accelerator program called Navigate 30 to 80, which is for product managers, tech leads, and organizational leaders in government. We also offer delivery management services for government projects, along with implementation partners like today's guest, Jason Forrest from Jason Forrest Agency. So I initially found Jason when I was looking for an implementation partner with experience developing and hosting custom data visualizations with a platform called Observable. And as we've gotten to know each other since then, I have just been so impressed with Jason's work, with his process. He just launched a new website called streetstostability.com, which is incredible. And one of the things I'm really excited to talk with him about has some really incredible stories about ways that through his work, he has, brought people together across really complex problem spaces and organizations to solve some really challenging problems together. And so, Jason, I'm so excited to have you on the program. Really excited to hear a little bit about your work. And we'll just turn it over to you. Why don't you start out with a brief introduction, and then I know you've got lots to show us.
Oh, I do. I do. I've got lots to show. All right. So, hi everybody. So I'm Jason Forrest. Hopefully you can see my screen now. Yeah, I've had a kind of a wild story. I went to art school. I became an electronic musician. I got involved in iOS technology, became a UX designer. Somehow I ended up getting hired by McKinsey about 9 years ago. I helped to really create a lot of unique projects for McKinsey and Company, their COVID response center. I helped to launch the McKinsey Health Institute. And then I made like a kind of a data viz agency inside of McKinsey called the Data Visualization Lab. And only recently I took that away from the firm and started as my own agency. So yay! In addition, I think it's going to be important to know, and I think that this will be painfully obvious, is that I am a data viz obsessive. I got involved in the field only about not even 7 full years ago, but it really was one of those clandestine decisions that all the pieces just kind of aligned, and I just got so excited about it. And as a result, I also co-founded and then still am the editor-in-chief of Nightingale, the Journal of the Data Visualization Society, which is a nonprofit or professional organization with about 28,000 people globally. And then we have a magazine. It's called Nightingale. It's incredible. And I always pitch to everybody. Sorry for the sales pitch at the beginning, but we're always looking for writers. So if you ever want to publish an article, we'll pair you with an editor. We'll pay you $50 and we'll promote it for you. So it's a good deal. It's a good deal. I swear. I swear. Okay. Now that bit of sticky stuff out of the way, into the next part of the sales pitch. This is the Jason Forrest Agency, a combination of our work. What I did at McKinsey was really what we're kind of continuing to do, which is effectively how do we take, innovative, empathetic, and yet intuitive ways of communicating data to business and industry. And in this case, we're talking about civic tech. Um, And my team really kind of, in my work, really for that matter, really kind of spans two different avenues. On one hand, we help people to build tools to explore data. This is a chart we made, an interactive chart we made for the Perkins School for the Blind. What you're seeing there effectively is the red areas are distances that are too far away from certain types of treatment centers for diagnosing a certain form of blindness in children. And on the right side, we also help people kind of come up with understand stories so that they can really build awareness, really stick the landing when it comes to a message. This is the cow chart. This is a chart we made for COP26, and McKinsey had actually published the same data 4 times previously, but it turns out you plop a cow in the middle of a 3D bar chart and you break the internet. So it was a really exciting one for us. So Brian asked me, like, and you already just mentioned, like, how do you actually go about trying to think a little differently about analytics? And Brian and I share a history in product management, a lot of software work, and I've done a lot of Agile over the years. And there's lots of different ways that different folks have talked about how do you actually show a methodology from the beginning to the end, the whole software development life cycle, the double diamond. There's a million of them. And my team and I have always thought about this for data visualization. Data as a concept is kind of notoriously low on process. A lot of our kind of data science oriented colleagues tend to kind of think about data science as a series of kind of problems, and there are certain kind of routines and phases that we kind of go through to kind of come up with like an answer. Boiling it down, I recognize. Our data engineering folks, I think, are a little bit more in the kind of like tasking things through. But when you come to like actual like people that are doing analytics, they don't really have a process. They go do the work and then it's done or something. And so my team really we have taken a lot of effort to try to not only define a methodology, but also define a working process that really puts people collaboration at the center of the methodology. And so um, uh, ultimately, any methodology is going to start with uncertainty. You have an idea of what you're supposed to be doing, a problem you're trying to solve. And then as you go through that, you'll be hopefully testing and validating it until you know what your solution would be and how you would provide, something to your user or audience. And my team's also a smidge different in that we always team up basically someone who's more technical, that could be a developer or a data scientist or a data engineer, with someone who's more visual, that could be a designer. And we try to be collaborative in code, but the reality is that you kind of need these two different mindsets to really make a difference when it comes to data visualization. Um, just to quickly hit this and then we'll move along. And then Brian, I'm actually going to ask if you have any responses because I can see the wheels turning, which is we basically break it into 4 phases. What we try to do is to prototype with the data before we really get into the story, which is effectively, we very much believe that data is a stakeholder. And even though you may have a communications objective, which we'll talk about in a second, and a certain kind of goal that you're trying to go towards, you need to be true to your data. And so prototyping the data is really the first phase. Then as you're kind of prototyping and figuring out like what the chart is, what the technology is, you're beginning your kind of user research, then you're kind of figuring out and piecing together your story. The story could be a dashboard, it could be a website, it could be a single chart, it could be a sculpture, right? But it's like coming up with the bigger kind of so what. And then really, there comes a part where rubber meets the road, you got to build the darn thing. And the one thing that I really, really felt passionately about when I was a UX designer and working in the kind of product space was that very often people didn't take ownership of marketing their work. They'd say, yay, it's done. We launched it. We hit the sprint target or epic. Check, the burn down chart. Yay, we did it. We didn't do it. And then that would be it. And they weren't focused on, training. They weren't focused on maintaining the work. They weren't focused on documenting all of what they needed, or they weren't even focused on adoption, right? That's somebody else's kind of problem to solve. And I always felt like that was a disconnect. Um, I can talk more about this, and we're going to jump into the communication objectives. But Brian, did you have any thoughts? Because again, I could see those wheels turning.
I'm gonna exercise a little restraint. I do want to mention something I forgot to say up front, which I normally do, which is just to let everyone who's tuned in know, we'll make a point of stopping at least twice, probably three times along the conversation to bring in questions that people brought with us. So I think I'm going to hold off until you got some really great stories about, a really mature project example, from New Jersey, and then with a brand new one, with San Francisco. So thank you, and I will jump in soon.
And for those of you tuning in, we've been having this conversation like how much do you talk about and show a slide versus there's so much to talk about. So that's so exciting. So okay, cool. Well, so what's the communication objective? Interestingly enough, when you're dealing with like the definition of learning materials, you really think about how do you define what you want as hopefully a teacher for someone else to learn. And we realized as we started the work that a communication objective was very similar. It's a little different than just like, what does the stakeholder or like what's the it's not, a little bit more than like we're going to make a website that does this, right? It's really about like what are you trying to communicate with people? And as I transitioned from being a UX designer to working in data visualization, the other thing that really gnawed on me is the word user. And specifically is because people don't really use data viz, they read data viz, right? And if you think about it from a product stance, like if you're making a product, you're usually like, uploading stuff, you're entering something, like saving, you're pushing data to a back end. Data viz isn't like that. Data viz, it's all passive. You're filtering to find data. You might be presented with a story, but ultimately you're an audience member. It's a one-way relationship, right? You're just ingesting this information. And so I really kind of pivoted away from user to audience. And so naturally, a communication objective becomes important. Some of these are concepts that you would probably be familiar with, like Agile. Who's your audience? What's the goal of the data viz? Obviously, what's the problem we're trying to solve for this audience? That's fairly conventional. This one, however, is a little bit different. What are the 3 to 5 most important insights you want people to remember, right? Again, they're going to take the knowledge that they're gaining from data viz and do something. What is that, right? The other thing that I think it's really important is what do we want as designers, developers, as technical professionals, as people involved in civic tech? Like, what do we want? Do we want to try to boost engagement? Do we want to sell something? Do we want to change people's minds? Are we trying to implant an idea into the social consciousness? And what's going to be more important than that, than understanding what emotion you're trying to create by doing so? And and as my team would probably tell you, I get really excited about marketing and all these different types of advertising strategies and stuff like that. But the reality is that when you're really focusing on a communication objective, it just gives you so much more insight for what you're trying to make and do. The next thing that's also really important is to align on how we work. Effectively, you kind of have a few phases. You always want to kick things off. You always want to define those communications objectives. The other big issue with data, you always want to get the data. I know it sounds insane, but really like 80% of all data viz projects start without data. I know it's crazy. So get the data, try to understand your access to that data, and try to figure out if there's a dictionary or a key. Like get to the data, right? That's going to be of our main clay we're going to shape. We do an ideation, a collaborative sketching ideation called Disco 4. It's kind of like Crazy Eights, but half the time. And that's been a lot of fun. But the point is that you want to get as many people on the team, and I mean the full team together, to collaborate on ideation, prototyping, refining those prototypes. And that's what you're going to see in this whole green phase here. So that you really begin that process from not knowing and uncertainty to knowing. And then before you're really getting into the weeds or the rubber meets the road or the building phase, you really got to make sure that all the leaders and stakeholders and the community is aligned, right? Like you want to make sure that you keeping all of the, the people that are really helping to shape larger projects in the weeds with you. And then from there, it's you're going to keep that same process going collaboratively, iterating, showing the design, validating it with the audience, the users, the community. And eventually, at some point, and it's usually what happens is after we move really solidly into like a development phase, we get our designers to start working on our documentation. Documentation is so important. And in many ways, it really defines even what success looks like for your projects. Because when you're done, the project may live, but unless people can find the documentation, it becomes a big issue. So wanted to go through and share that. And now wanted to dig into our first of two case studies. This is a project that we did, a rather long project actually we did with the New Jersey Department of Health. This was on long-term care centers. And so the big key question here was, how do we collaborate with different mindsets in civic tech? Um, I know from Brian and my conversations that this is something that's going to resonate with a lot of folks. Certainly in my professional career, it absolutely has been, how do you collaborate with these different types of folks with different types of perspectives and skills and mindsets? So just to kind of orient folks, this was a project that we made. It was to be compliant to some mandates for data access. We designed this whole project in Figma and built it all with Tableau. So the technology is not really something special here. This is something that's, I think, extremely common. I mean, it literally was an iframe that we put into like a WordPress page. So this is not complicated technology. What was really important was that really as an aftershock of the pandemic, the real world importance to provide better data with clarity was so important. And in our user research, we learned very early on that very few people are coming to a dashboard like this in a relaxed state of mind, right? Something has happened with their loved one that they need to find care urgently, right? They may not be, they may have, and they very likely don't have any experience dealing with nursing homes or long-term care centers, right? And so the need to calibrate information for a very, very generalized and fragile audience was going to be really important. And so working on a major project in state government meant that we had a lot of different types of mindsets and types of professionals. We had deeply experienced nursing staff, deeply experienced Department of Health leadership, and a very robust and rather large IT technology group really focused on data engineering. And so as we started to do the initial research to figure out exactly who were the personas that we needed to try to address, we realized that the general public was actually a little broad, right? And like the state leaders were a little broad because we realized that what a Department of Health stakeholder might need would be actually a lot different than the working team. At the same time, between the general public and the public sector and the general the constituents was really a layer of advocacy. And the advocate group were fascinating. Happy to talk more about this in the Q&A, but doing user research, user testing, usability testing with the advocate group actually was a major point towards creating a more successful interface overall for the project. Okay, so we started with the research. We figured out our personas. We did a competitive scan. What are other states doing? What are other kind of private sector websites? Making a map and putting some pins on it. Not that difficult at this point anymore. Did a lot of researching into benchmarking. There in New York City, where I live, there is a lot of really great tools when it comes to understanding what how schools are being the success level of schools. And so there's lots of, as you can see here, these kind of red, yellow, green. We like to steer away from that in data viz terms these days. But regardless, like very easily understandable calibrations for this is good. They're not doing as good with that. Um, and then we went through, we made lots of prototypes, and we did, as you can see, just like a lot of teams do, a lot of cards, a lot of testing, got the comments. And what I wanted to do next was really talk about how we used this user testing. So before I jump into these three big points, and I'll have some slides that'll illustrate this a little bit more, what was fascinating, and you'll be shocked to hear this, especially you, Brian, with your history, is that we had to prove the worth of user testing, right? All of these great collaborators and colleagues that we had were like, it's going to take another 2 weeks. Why would we do that, right? And they were like, well, we don't have anybody. We don't have anybody in New Jersey we can test. Right, right. So we went through, we started with a round of friends and family, and that was so interesting that extended into folks that were more family, friends and family, and then advocates for the state of New Jersey. And our research really broke it down into three big categories, which was don't make me think, define and contextualize, and be transparent. And so for don't make me think, one of the things that I found fascinating is that there's inherently, I think it was a little bit more than 200 nursing homes in New Jersey. And putting 200 dots on a map just is busy, right? And so one of the big questions is, will anyone be able to understand what these dots mean? And so as we started to test this, we had all very much assumed that everybody was going to want the most minimal, the most simple interface. That was not the case. Don't underestimate your audience. Just because something might be busy doesn't mean that they're not willing to go the extra mile to try to understand it. And what we found time and time again, overwhelmingly, is that people picked the B category below because we thought it was going to be too busy. There's all these occlusions where things are stacking up on top of each other. But seeing the star with the color on the pin was hands down the winner, hands down. Now, what you're seeing is actual quotes from some of those tests. The other thing was interesting is that once we had the user testing, we now had ammunition. So we could go back to our colleagues, our well-intentioned colleagues, and say, well, we understand that you said this. However, this is what we found in the testing. The other thing that was really, really important was just how important it was to contextualize all this data. So we pulled, and I'll show you this in a little bit, a lot of different type of data from a lot of different type of sources. Each one of them had different benchmarking. Each one of them had different refresh rates. And so simple calibration with these labels that say lower is better in the last 12 months, the star rating, so they all had the same color and the same format, that became just crucially important. The other thing that you can see in notes here was that using plain common language was also just like it was such a big part of the battle because healthcare professionals and healthcare in general has a lot of complicated terminology. And so filled with acronyms. And so also coming up with an FAQ page that has a simple list of terminology and definitions was also really, really important. The other thing was transparency, right? Like being able to give people, oh yeah,
Jason, I'm so sorry. Can you just go back one slide?
absolutely.
I just realized that there's a lot on this slide that adds more texture to the story of who uses this and for what. I wonder if you could just pause on that to bring the users to life a little bit. Like what are the advocates doing with this site? What are the end users doing with this site? Can you add a little color to that for us?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So again, I would say the most common user would be a person that needs to find a nursing home or move their loved one from one nursing home to another. A. B, advocates are obviously looking at how they can make it better or point out something worse. They have a bit more of an agenda to use this data. Now, at the same time, what we found when speaking with them is that they had different definitions and terminology that were not aligned. So even though they were looking at state and federal documents, having it all centralized, having all that knowledge in the same place was another thing of another level of transparency that let people be involved in the conversation. And to a degree, even give them a place to begin to agree, right? Now, the other catch was there very much is a tremendous amount of detail in any one of these things. Like, even why would you need to know what the total nursing staff is, right? Like, and it seems kind of obvious, but when you kind of dig into like what the metric's really trying to be, what you're trying to find in the metric, or how maybe the DOH is trying to monitor a metric that's so simple like nursing staff, is you start to look at things like turnover rates, right? And if you have a nursing home where nurses are constantly coming in and going out, then that's going to give you it's going to send a different signal to how you legislate and monitor that facility versus also there was a lot of metrics here about number of beds available, a number of complaints from the government, the also certain there were certain categories of what's the word I'm looking for, discrepancies, including like, deaths that were in some way the cause of the facility and things like that. So it was really serious data and really giving people the ability to learn, like to self-serve that information was really important. All right, I know we got a bunch of pages. I'm gonna keep going. All right,
Uh,
what?
well, so can I just say back to you some of the user stories I just heard to make sure I've got it right? So I think what you're explaining is, if I've got an aging parent, I think many of us probably have aging parents. I have an aging parent, and I need to put my dad in a nursing home. This is where I can go to figure out, am I going to feel good about the place that I'm putting him? Or, if my dad has been abused and I need to move him somewhere else, this is where I can go to figure out, am I going to feel confident at that place I'm moving him to? And I'm stressed out, I'm angry, it's like it's an urgent situation. This is also the same, so I see you nodding. This is also the same source of information that the advocacy groups are going to use to say, like, we've got to do something about elder abuse. And again, this is, an incredible twist, I think. Am I understanding right that also the Department of Health is using this to keep up, so that the same website that the Department of Health, or the same data set that the Department of Health is using to monitor compliance and to keep up on, who do we need to go inspect, et cetera. It's the same exact data source and it's the same exact information, same interface that I'm using to find a place for my dad and that the advocates are using when they go advocate. And that's the constellation of interests you're bringing together all in this one place. Am I getting that all right?
100%.
Incredible.
And I will yes and it for you to say that inspection reports themselves were something that we had a huge challenge with. The reports were really important for the DOH. They were all posted on PDF format, right? So the data wasn't really readily available. And then trying to define and contextualize the language in the report, which was a part of the mandate, was a situation where you were potentially mixing the use cases for those audiences, where a regular person for the public would come in when you see basically a lot of administrative speech and terminology. And so, yeah, even again, managing like who's going to use this and what do we need to give them to help them understand why this is important for what they need, as well as for what other people would need.
Yeah.
So yeah, very, very important. Thanks for putting the brakes on and explaining that.
Thank you.
So the other thing that's really important when it comes to data is providing the information that people, they can trust it. And part of that is identifying the source. Part of that is identifying the refresh rate, right? A lot of these metrics are only updated yearly. Some of them are monthly. Some of them are just random, especially those inspection reports. They're whenever they are made. And you could have 10 inspections in a year or none, right? Like it just kind of depends. And so finding ways that you can create this kind of one-stop shop where people can come in, learn about the terms, learn about the data sources. And this extends to the public, your end audience and user, also to our kind of professional colleagues. They also needed to have a one-stop shop for all this information. And that became another major part of this whole project. And I'd like to point out this comment over here. I'd rather bring our level of knowledge up than dummy stuff down. On the flip side of that is don't assume that everybody's on your level, right? So that's another one of these interesting kind of tightropes that we have to walk between specific knowledge and applying. The last phase of this, I talked about documentation, and to that point, I just made previously, documenting the engineering and the code, also the practice and the process of doing the research was very important. And especially when it came to, because we had to create a number of APIs to actually pull this data, the refreshing of the different types of data from different federal and state sources and private sources was non-trivial. And so we even had to leave them a very involved map for exactly how they would go in and be able to adjust the API and pull the data in. So this diagram, several like it, were really brought in to go through and to really be a map for our technical colleagues. The last thing I'll say about this one is it's one thing to make a map that's complicated and covers the whole range of complexity of a system. But what I probably didn't put in the slide, and I remember and want to index on now, is that we had 4 training classes just to walk through this. I think we had 2 different meetings just to explain it and then to re-explain it. And then we had 2 working sessions where people actually opened up the code and test out different Python scripts and exactly say, oh, this script does the red line. And oh, this is what happens. You have to change this file from between these 2 servers in this green part and stuff like that. And, again, the goal isn't to make it and ship it and pat ourselves in the back. The goal is to make things that will live on for the people that need them. Right.
And
All right. So that's my QA. We made it. We made it.
we made it. I want to go here. Can you just go back to the slide
All
one
right.
second? Yeah. I just want to, I think there are probably a lot of people on this Zoom who have heard ETLs. And maybe you don't even know what ETLs are. It stands for extract, transform, and load, right? Extract the data, transform it into whatever shape we need it to be for the visualization that we need, and then load it into the system, like the interactive tool that you were showing a second ago. I think very few people have actually seen what do those ETLs do? How many different systems does it touch? This is a map of the sort of full landscape of ETLs that you all built, right? At the top, the sources where you're extracting the data from. In the middle, all of the transformation happening. And at the very bottom, that one line, loading it into the new system. Is that correct?
Yep.
So I just wanted to call that out because I think so few people have seen something visualized as clearly as this. And I think it just like really makes so clearly visible how complex,
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the stuff going on in the background that's invisible to so many of us actually is. So thank you for going back. Now let's do some Q&A. I'm sure people have some questions. I know people also want to hear about Streets of Stability. All right, I see a question.
Stopping to share. Back in the talking mode. Yes.
Okay, so here's a question in the Q&A. Is the user research for data visualization the same as user research for web applications, or is it a different skill set?
In my opinion, it's exactly the same. The divergence is who's in that conversation, right? Having a user conversation kind of, try to I think I had a hiccup there, to try to ask open-ended questions, to try to make sure that you're not leading people, that you're really just kind of saying, well, how would you use this? What does this mean to you? Things like that. That's not really basically nobody in analytics has ever gotten that training. Like, that's not even being like, sweeping or controversial, right? It's just not a part of what their job description is and how they got there. So doing user tests is really important. And this is really, again, speaks to the combination of someone that's more technical and someone that's more designy, because together you can interpret that in a way that's going to be really interesting. Now, to your point, we just talked about ETLs and the complexities of data engineering. That actually is something that comes up. And if you're technical people, they may see how something's loading and the performance is not working right. And if your technical people aren't into those user calls, which they almost always are never in, then they may not understand the importance for having a performant infrastructure, and that's especially important, especially when you get to BI tools like Tableau and Power BI, because they may not be performant, and maybe you do need to realize that you need to find ways of speeding up your data engineering and infrastructure. So yeah, but all in all, the testing process is exactly the same.
Great. All right, let's take one more before we get to the next story, and then I'll encourage people to keep submitting questions. We'll do at least one more round before we wrap up here. So next question in the queue, you had mentioned the importance of marketing and communications after a product is built for the nursing home dashboard. How did you get the word out?
So that was an interesting one. Because of these mixed audiences, the first level was really alerting the actual nursing homes and the nursing home operators that the tool existed, right? So the first goal was to get the nursing homes to basically acknowledge and begin to use the tool itself, because that's kind of like the people that are going to have the most skin in the game. The second was the New Jersey DOH actually does have a marketing campaign. They do have things like flyers and billboards and stuff like that. Now, I don't recall seeing any, nursing home billboards, but I know that it was definitely shared broadly on state websites and access and search engines. And so they definitely found ways to continue to elevate the profile. The last thing, and this is something that table stakes, it should be table stakes for anybody, is we went out and did demos. We got out there and we started showing people our work and talking through it. And this could be, they were different. We gave talks to different aspects of the technology groups. We gave different departments within the DOH. We gave a mini presentation in front of the entire DOH, which included, I think, the lieutenant governor. So the point is, get out there and try to spread the message. And if it works, then people will help spread it for you.
Great. All right. Thank you, folks, for questions. Jason, thank you for those explanations. Let's jump ahead to talk about your work in San Francisco. We've got this new website that just went live. I think there's a lot of interest in it. I'm interested to hear more about it for sure. Take us there.
All right. So this one's going to be a slightly different version of the talk. It's going to be a little bit more conversational, and they'll give us some more QA time. So the question that we're trying to solve with this one is, or that we'll talk about especially, is how did we use, or how do we use data viz to explore and tell a complicated story? Homelessness in San Francisco is not only a political issue, it's a deeply complicated, extremely nuanced, and ultimately a very human issue. So the project is called streetstostability.com. It is what we'd like to think is a landmark report on homelessness in San Francisco. It's created for a family office, and the goal was to really help support policymakers, especially as they transition into office or continue in office during the election. So the goal was specifically to make this thing that's going to kind of focus people's attention on certain policy points, and then hopefully give them the ammunition to actually go about and make real and lasting change. Unlike the last project that was made with Tableau, we used a new technology on this. It's called Observable Framework. Observable is effectively the company by the team that invented D3.js. D3.js is effectively how you can program your browser to make shapes. So those shapes can be bars, they can be dots, they can be squiggly things that go all over the place, but that's kind of what it is. D3.js started as a quirky framework and has increasingly become, although ultimately JavaScript, but it's increasingly become more and more generic, more and more indexable for full stack developers, especially. And so the catch here was, and my team and I, or I should say, my team and all the other teams that we've been working with on this have been on this journey for quite a while. I think we started in February. And what we learned, the goal always was how can we use data visualization to understand the complexity? Um, so what happened when we started this project is we were given a very big and frankly quite messy Miro board. And our friends and colleagues had done a lot of research in pulling together all of the service providers for unhoused folks in San Francisco, along with phases of homelessness, money that had been documented about different city agencies and departments. And the very first question, and frankly, we thought that this would be the whole story, was how can you show how complicated the system is? And so what was fascinating is that as we went through the research and the iterations of trying to prototype this data and try to say, does this make sense? Does that make sense? How are we using colors? Like, well, how are we going to visualize 230 service providers, right? They all have different size names. Like it was just, there were so many questions that came up as we went through. And even understand, and at every point, it just created more questions, right? Like, are these the phases of homelessness? Even again, foundational questions would really bring up lots and lots of conversations. And so as we started to build through this version of the document, and people in the team got very excited about it, and I'm still very excited about it months later, we started to think, well, okay, we've done this like for like the whole system, and that gives you one view of the data. What if we're able to go through and do a version of this specifically for one of the 6 personas we have? Yes, there's 7 people there. I'll explain that in a second. And so we did that. We also went through and said, okay, so we have 2 that we visualized fully for Frank. This is Frank's. Oh, this is Yara. There's Frank and Yara. Yara is this person in the kind of purple, and Frank is this person in the red. And what you're able to do is then go through and tease out, like, these are what their stories kind of look like for what this persona represents. And as we did this, we not only used it to figure out, like, well, what's happening with these service providers and, like, are they overlapping? But we also used visualization like this to ensure accuracy. And if any of my colleagues are listening in, they'll know that we had to iterate on the data a number of times. There would be situations where a simple bug in the data with like a misspelling would make an entity show up twice, or something about how the data had been structured might actually collapse things together in a way that didn't really make sense. How do we make something with this much text legible? And so there was a lot of iteration just on the fact that as you interact with it, the labels are kind of like front and center in the middle. And what you're trying to show is the connections and in many ways the overlaps. But you're kind of always focused on what overlaps and connections are being made. So the personas themselves were something that had been started before, or as my team came into the project, but it was something that's been a real guiding force for us. And I know that, again, some of my colleagues really drove this. They always very much wanted to be a human-based look at homelessness in San Francisco. And as we started to build out these
Hey,
personas,
Jason.
oh yeah,
Jason, I'm so sorry. Can you just go back? Okay, I just want to make sure we're bringing everyone along with us. There's so much great thought work that went into what you're showing on the screen here. Can I just make sure? Let me just double back
please,
and tell you what I understand, and you tell me if this is right.
I
So
love it.
on the left, what we have below the persona, illustrations is the individual stops on a persona's journey. At the top, entering homelessness. What are the conditions that went from being housed to all of a sudden in their life unhoused? Then the orange dots represent step by step their journey through homelessness. And then at the bottom, those last steps are exiting homelessness and becoming housed people. And so, when you talked about sort of wrangling through how do you even sort of define those steps? On the left, we see the steps and the consensus around what the steps are, right?
Exactly.
Then if I if I click those, so if I go to Streets of Stability slash people, I see this visual. If I click any of those steps, we get the little threads that lead us to the semicircle. And that
Mhm.
semicircle is the 250 different organizations that provide services relevant to unhoused people, right?
Mhm.
And then,
Yes,
okay,
but so as you move into the personas, it begins to filter them down a little bit,
okay,
right? Because this is the whole realm of 230x service providers. As you move into the personas, you may only have like 120.
okay.
But
And then to the right, what are those blue dots?
these are city departments. So the sheriff, the Department of Public Housing, and I think it just goes through them right here. Yeah. Department of Public Health, Mayor's Office, Housing Supporting Works, Public Works, etc. And so you'll actually see how many service providers they fund, and you can actually also see the amount of funding on the actual service providers themselves, which again is really important and illuminating.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, sorry to
So
interrupt. Please keep going.
no, I love it. And it's funny because this is my world. I've been living inside of it. It's so easy to zip past the detail, right? And, but it's funny because even in visualizing this, we had to go through and consolidate and explain and to a degree even defend enduring and exiting. And so like every part of this project, the visualization guided a large portion of the conversation of how we could create recommendations. And so we had this really interesting meeting. It would have been like, I guess, even maybe all the way back in March or April, where we really, the first version was just going to have that and this. That was it. This was the whole project. And it was a single page. And we had a very thoughtful leader on a call. And she said, well, this is very illuminating, but what's it supposed to be? And we were all like, yeah, it should be better, right? It should be better than this, right? And so that set out a many month journey to explore and try to penetrate how the system is organized today and how it should be organized. And so the bigger issue, and again, please read the report. All the official language is there. It's very nuanced, very complete, and very thoughtful. But the high level takeaway is that the issue isn't necessarily money, and the issue isn't necessarily political, but it is administrative and trying to find ways to make the system more navigable. At the moment, there's lots of different organizations that are working potentially in parallel, but having people to guide unhoused folks through the system will make it so much more better monitored and easily it would be more easily tailored to the needs of each one of these people. So as we started to figure out what's the future state, what should it look like? And so effectively, here's a person, they're coming in through a front door, they have a dedicated companion. That companion would help them to find the services to create stability, to give them interim housing, to help them with transportation, to help them with health services, to help them get a job. And then there would be city coordinators that would basically help coordinate all the different city offices, right? So they're kind of meeting a handshake. But it didn't really make sense like this. And then we tried it this way, and it didn't really make sense that way. And so we every time, and it was very, very iterative. I mean, we're talking like 5 and 10 iterations a day to try to get to something where eventually we started to think about here's what it is today, and here's what it should be in the future. And so these diagrams went through so many iterations to try to come up with different ways. You could see we tried to pull in the semicircle, these kind of flower type shapes, how do we show through that? And then we started to realize that there's just a lot of paths. And then we really ended up, I guess I'm out of order a little bit, but as we started to go through, we started to realize that honestly, it's just a tangle today. And what we need in the future is it to be much more of a journey that's facilitated. So as we were going through and really using the diagrams to dig into the realities, but also the concept of what true civic change could be, we also realized that we needed to learn more about the journey through homelessness than just what we had before. So again, hopefully you're starting to see is that as one chart comes in and we start to explore the data, we're like, yeah, but there's another data set over here, and we got to look at that one. Oh, actually, this one makes us look at these other 2 points. So it almost becomes something like a decision tree where you're trying to figure out and investigate what the story is so that you can try to make effective policy recommendations. This is a Sankey chart. That's what it's called when it kind of goes from one side to the other with these kind of bands. Each one of them are representative of the actual number of unhoused people. I think one of the challenges with San Francisco, and again, you see in the report, is that there's a lot of folks that are economically vulnerable, predominantly in relation to housing stock. And when people become unhoused, there's lots of different reasons why they're unhoused. Some of them exit, some of them remain chronic, and then some are only able to make it shorter. As we did the charts, we would work on the policy recommendations and then go back to the diagrams. But at some point, and this is a little insider tip, we started making color correlations so that when you see the orange, we're really talking about people that are just entering in. And when you see this blue, this is really the exit. And so across the whole article and report, we try to keep these colors relatively important to what they represent. So we finally finished up the diagrams. This is what the system looks like today. This is how they kind of compare to each other. And we really wanted to leave with this kind of like from and to. There's so much, even in these diagrams, that we can talk about it for a long time. But what became really important for us again was the iterations and the testing. Service providers, they were definitely shown to folks in city government. They're definitely shown across the family office and with different experts, specifically as it relates to San Francisco. And it's really that level of research in what matters, which what I think has been the difference in how the visuals have been received, right? The goal isn't making a cool chart. The goal is to make something that inspires someone to actually create change. And that's kind of why we're so excited about this project, is that the feedback we're getting from public officials, from citizens in San Francisco feels different. It feels like people want to actually have this conversation and engage in the hard and the challenging complexities of dealing with the human stories and homelessness. I think this is the last one. Maybe it's the second to last one. So as we're building all of it, we realize that even understanding how does a decision get made was really kind of important. And one of our stakeholders sketched this out on a napkin one night. I think he sent it to me at like 9 o'clock at night. Hey, make this for tomorrow. Like, what? And what I want to talk about with this one, which is kind of interesting, is that there were two things that we learned as we got into this project, and specifically after we talked with service providers and people that were like boots on the ground. The first thing was that there's really a lot of kind of community stakeholders, right? So even taking the time to try to identify, like, these are the state government, this is the federal government. We also realized that the first version of this actually had unhoused people in the middle. And the diagram we thought was like, well, this is all the people that unhoused have to navigate. And as we started to think through it, we're like, no, this is really a document that's focused really on policymakers, and to a degree to also build empathy with those folks, because they're making very, very hard decisions and have a lot of complexities and nuances in these relationships. The last thing I was going to talk about with this is that as we went through and did lots of different charts and data, we also tried to really back away from keeping the numbers too hard-edged. So you'll notice that we have these kind of blushes of color to kind of show these kind of groupings of different types of organizations in San Francisco. And again, this could be comparable to most cities and states, and to a degree the federal government. But the hard edges actually is what people reacted really strongly to. And when you basically soften things up and say, these are the entities, and we don't necessarily need to get in an argument about something on the edge, or yeah, there's a 10%, but it could be 15%. That's not the point, right? Let's keep focused on the bigger story and kind of show the directional progress and direction that things have been and how they exist today and how they could move in the future. And so wrapping up here, where this kind of landed is my colleagues in Crankstart have now created the 12 policy recommendations. On the website, you actually see them broken down into these 12 recommendations. Each one of them is broken into action points that goes into further detail. And then there's usually like what they're calling currently the mayor's 100-day plan, which even moves into outcomes, potential outcomes, or how you would actually measure effectiveness. This whole project, streets2stability.com, was launched as a website, I guess about 2 weeks ago now. And there will be a long form report, which is what we're really finishing up right now. And that is about 100 pages long. So if there was something, if there was a policy issue or a question you had about the online report, they go into very detailed methodology and description on each one of these points. I think there's case studies for every one of them. So like it's really a pretty deep and dense document. So that's what's coming next. So
Awesome.
yeah.
So much great stuff there, Jason. I wonder, maybe I'll jump in with the first question, and then we'll open it up to the last round of Q&A here. So, at the very last slide, one the title of today's live stream is Designing High Impact Data Analytics, right? And so one of the things that is really striking to me about all of the work that you've shared today is, we're not just talking about emotionally impactful for the viewer, we're also talking about impactful to the world and the change, that these projects seek. And I think you have a number of examples, and I think we probably only have time for one, or I'll only ask for one, a number of examples of ways that the people who brought you on to visualize the problem and do this research, who were developing the policy, their experience of going through this process with you was that, this process ended up informing the policy recommendations and impacting the policy recommendations that are coming out in this report that's about to get released. I wonder if you could just zero in on one, like one place where, as a result of the work that, you and your team did with the policy, recommenders, how did this interaction with the data and the research have an impact on the policy recommendations? Could you just give us one awesome example?
Um, well, good question. It's funny because it's like they're kind of like linked on like a molecular level, right? Like, well, so as we started to look, there was a question about housing supply. And one of the colleagues went through and did a very, very deep analysis of available properties. And they had presented us with the data in a way that I didn't find especially meaningful. And as we went through and started to untangle that data for a single chart, that brought out other questions. And then we could do certain maps. And then when we do a certain map, they say, oh, well, actually, that creates one of the biggest problems with homelessness is NIMBYism, so not in my backyard. And so so we learn about like some of the challenges from the service providers, and that helps us to understand like, well, again, if you soften up, that helps foster the progress we're looking to be expecting, right? That we don't want. Again, visualization is the working way of been establishing the 12 recommendations. The recommendations themselves were, as the Word document was crafted over about a month period, the chart showed in the, and then increasingly it was like, well, the text was actually explaining why the chart looks a certain way, how the data was collected, what's referring. an outside-in approach. Because it is so nuanced and it is so complicated and it's so human that you have to, you have to pull the threads to try to untangle it one bit at a time. Hopefully in the walkthrough that also was apparent that there wasn't like an aha 6,000, it could be 48. No, that's not the point. It's not the point. Honestly, the numbers in this are, that's not the point. The point is, how do we understand the situation so that we can try to make real change? Last thing, and maybe I wasn't as clear of an answer as I probably had in my mind when I started talking, but we actually did hear back from a number of the service providers, and the clients, so Crankstart, actually heard back from people they didn't work with. And that was interesting. And not only were they issuing their congratulations, but they really were like, this was something that we hadn't really thought about in this way before. So to even have people in the space say that it's kind of changed how they frame and think about the situation is very much part of the impact that we're looking to accomplish.
Great. So I know that it's 2 o'clock and I want to be respectful of people's time. I do see some questions. Are you able to go for another 5 minutes so we can get to a couple of the questions in the queue here? Okay, thanks so much. Um, you had mentioned as a UXer, you found people didn't take ownership of marketing their work. How do you align documentation goals with your team? What does documentation look like for your team? How does your team take ownership of documenting everything they need, et cetera, et cetera?
I don't think documentation is that hard. I think that people focus on writing things down, and you have to, there's no way around it. I think the goal ultimately is, how do you keep if you died, how would someone pick up your work and continue it, right? Do they have the logins? Do they have the passwords, right? What I always do is we do screen grabs every page and we just say, like, this is how this is a filter, this thing, the 3 lines in the corner is the hamburger menu on, just like the basics, and just kind of document it that way. At the same time, as we're usually building an FAQ, we put that into the document. FAQ and terminology is something that almost always is a living document, and these things do change in time. So that level of documentation is important. There's probably another kind of question, which is maybe what you're hinting at, like how people use like the Confluence, I think, is the one of them, where it's like a big, like Jira way of kind of documenting everything. Box, all of the kind of sharing things. It's definitely where information goes to die. So like you want to try to figure out how that you're like making things and keeping them in a place where people would know how to find them. And then last but not least, I just make a PowerPoint that has, or PDF that has basically all the screens and all the basics, who to reach, and just try to make sure that as many people know where it is as possible, right? Luckily, in a civic project, you're going to have a department that's going to have some structure that's going to stay there. So documentation is not that hard. It's just about taking the time to do it.
Nice. Thank you. I see one more from Kim Harrington, who didn't post it anonymously, which I think is awesome. Can we just end with her question? One more. Kim says, the landscape
Sure.
slide with the soft edged bubbles is far more complex than most will understand. How did you turn that around in an evening? Exclamation point.
All right. Thank you, Kim. I'm going to answer that question, but I'm going to re-answer my last question, which is documentation is a mindset. Documentation is taking ownership of how you can transfer your knowledge to somebody else. And that's why it doesn't matter if it's PowerPoint. That's why if we made this ETL document and we had to do 4 calls to explain it, that's what it is. If it's complex, guess what? Sometimes people need time to understand things. Documentation is a mindset. So that's my much more succinct and much more better answer. So thank you. All right. So Kim, the landscape slide, when you're designing, I mean, I think I don't know you, Kim, but I think we're LinkedIn friends. When you get in the mode, you can just kind of bash stuff out, right? And as a designer, like you're already in the space. I was already living in this kind of San Francisco homelessness landscape for like 6 months. You get like the kind of crappy napkin sketch with like a bunch of vagueness, but I was already aligned towards like, oh, I can understand what this might try to solve. I would understand, as you make a diagram, you're trying to focus on what it's going to communicate to somebody else, right? And so honestly, it wasn't that hard, um, because I was already so steeped in the problem space and really had been so immersed in the audience and the testing. So it wasn't that bad.
Great. All right, we're at 2:05. Jason, as always, I really enjoy talking to you, and I'm so appreciative that you took the time to do this today. Um, I'll post this on YouTube as well, and thank you so much again for being here. Really, really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, folks, for tuning in. Bye.
Okay. Bye, everybody.